To some, sipping mezcal in the tropical sun every day might sound like the dream life. In Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, it becomes a nightmarish descent into alcoholism for Geoffrey Firmin, the British consul to Mexico. The novel details Geoffrey's disintegration over the course of the Day of the Dead in 1938, in a dark but astonishing feat of writing. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Professor Sue Weiss from the University of Sheffield. I hope our conversation inspires you to read Under the Volcano, if not to drink quite as much as Geoffrey Firmin, and please leave a comment if you have anything to say about Lowry's novel. Sue Weiss is Professor in the School of English at the University of Sheffield. She's the author of several books, including Introducing Bakhtin, a brilliant theorist of literature who we'll discuss briefly in this episode, Textual Deceptions, which is a fascinating account of hoaxes in contemporary literature, and Holocaust fiction as an area to which Sue has contributed a huge amount of important work. And in fact, her most recent work is on the same topic, her latest book being Claude Lanzmann's Shoah Outtakes, Holocaust Rescue and Resistance, which was published in 2021. And she's currently writing a study of Holocaust representation in popular British and Irish fiction. It's a great pleasure to have her on the podcast to talk about Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. Thank you so much for joining me, Sue, and pleasure to be talking with you about Under the Volcano. To begin with, could you say a little bit about the novel and why you think people might like to read it?
It's really an honour to be here. And to start with summarising what we might call the plot of Under the Volcano, as the title suggests, it's set in Mexico. And it's about, without giving anything away, it's about the last day in the life of the character called Geoffrey Firmin, a former British consul living in Mexico, who's also an alcoholic. Its setting is the Day of the Dead, 1938. It's extremely specifically set then. So that's the 31st of October, the festival which unites the old pre-Columbian festivals with the Catholic overlay of Christianity. So it's also the day that Geoffrey's wife, Yvonne, returns, and there's a refrain throughout the novel of saying it's the Day of the Dead, the one day when the dead return to the living. So there's a kind of a spectral quality, you could say, to that narrative as well.
And I know it's a novel you've been writing about for a long time. What is it that keeps bringing you back to it? Because it's excruciating to read in many respects, brilliantly written. But I mean, as Geoffrey unravels, it's tough, sort of empathetically. So yeah, what is it that keeps drawing you back to it?
That is a really good question. As you know, I wrote my PhD on it. And then I kept thinking about it for a long time afterwards. And we did for a while set it on a contemporary literature, i.e. post-war course at Sheffield. And it's a kind of novel for students. People would either absolutely love it and really get very involved in it, or they would really find it a bit overwhelming, partly for the reasons that you say. I think what I would say, I was really delighted to have the chance to reread it. It was like meeting an old friend again, partly because, as you say, it's so beautifully written. It's also extremely gripping. So I feel if anybody listening to this decides to have a go, I would suggest read at least the first two chapters before making a final decision. It's slightly unusual in that the first chapter is a flash forward. The action of that first chapter occurs after the main body of the novel has finished. So you sort of know what's coming as you start to read, which is a good thing in a way, because it's like a warning. So it's not a surprise, but it does mean that you're a bit more invested perhaps in the characters and their destiny, wishing things could turn out differently for them. But I think for me, it's the linguistic inventiveness, and that just it's so interesting to read about these expatriate people from different backgrounds in Mexico of this just before the Second World War. And as you said, it's something that's has stayed in my mind all that time. And as I was reading, I thought there are some phrases that I've just never forgotten. They're always in my mind. I wrote some of them down. They're not always very positive. One of them is the paradise of his despair. That phrase, which is in the mind of Geoffrey a lot, kind of sums up his mindset. He drinks a lot. He's also very tired. He can't sleep. And he has this phrase that thoughts are in his mind like a procession of little elderly animals. I often find myself thinking back to that phrase. It's so evocative. That seems exactly how, when you're very tired, thoughts go very slowly through your mind. He describes having drunk far too much as a horripilating hangover thunderclapping about his skull. And again, I feel Lowry's wordplay is really great, but it also does give you an insight into the terrible feeling that Geoffrey has after drinking far too much. And the final thing that often I feel is in my mind is, because it's the Day of the Dead, there's like a big carnival going on in the little town where it's set, including a massive Ferris wheel, and the consul, was his former job, that's how he's referred to a lot throughout, gets onto the Ferris wheel, and when he's upside down, everything falls out of his pockets, including his passport and his money, everything. He gets some of it back, but not all of it. And he thinks to himself, let it all go. And I often find myself thinking, when you think something's gone, I've misplaced it, let it all go. So though it's, for him, it's like a tragic giving up of his past and his life, there's also a kind of a carnivalesque angle to that, just letting things go.
And actually, I mean, that episode with the Ferris wheel brings me nicely on to the next question I was going to ask, which is, how would you describe the mood of the novel? I mentioned earlier, it's excruciating in many ways. And as you mentioned, we already know things are not going to end well for Geoffrey, and we're sort of with him each step of the way. That not that much happens a lot of the time, except Geoffrey drinks more when he really shouldn't. But other bits are extremely funny. He somehow ends up on the Ferris wheel and the stuff's falling out. It's hilarious, but at the same time, just terribly, terribly sad for him. So, I mean, could you sort of put words to how you might describe it? Is it comic? Is it tragic? Is it what, you know?
That's a really great question. I think what you're kind of hinting at, that it's tragicomic, is correct. I mean, it is very sad to read, but the reason it's sad is because you start to feel a lot for each of the characters, not just Geoffrey, the consul, but his estranged wife, Yvonne, who's also really an amazing and touching character. When I was thinking about what register it has and what kind of feeling you have when you've finished reading it, I think you're right that somehow the drinking is part of the tragicomedy, because on the one hand, you really wish that Geoffrey would stop drinking. On the other, it's not completely a realist depiction of drink. I think some critics have actually tried to count the number of drinks he has, and it's beyond, it's only a day, and he has far more drinks than anyone could possibly have. Or does he, you could say, because it's filtered through his mind that it's all quite unreliable anyway. So it's a tragic story about individual suffering and doomed love. But I suppose there are two things that really redeem it, apart from the humour, as you say. It's got a lot of dry humour. Geoffrey's next door neighbour says to him, you're not on the wagon, you're on the funeral wagon, which is kind of typical of the mordant wordplay, I think. But I feel it's full of life, partly because of the writing. I know that's a cliche to say that, but the writing is so inventive and so full of energy and life that, in a way, that's it's not just a compensation, but it's the consul mentions throughout he's writing a book. He doesn't say it's a novel, But in a way, I suppose you come to think, is this the kind of book he would have written? It's like a compendium of history and science and poetry. So there's that, I feel. And it's also about a sort of political engagement. The third character to mention is the consul's half-brother Hugh, who's been in Spain at the time of the Civil War. So I think a lot of the discussions that he has with Yvonne and with his half-brother, the consul, are about engagement and action and what that means. So though the political aspect is itself quite tragic and upsetting because we know what's coming, all of this give more of life to it, I think, than you might expect.
Yeah. We'll come back to that political aspect of the novel in a moment. I think first to say, I was actually wondering, there are like certain films and novels where people try to keep up with the drinking. I'm trying to think, is With Nail and I one of those? I something like that, you know, where people try to go drink for drink with the characters. And I was wondering if anybody tried it with Geoffrey and how that went, but I mean, not well, I would imagine. But as you
Really
say,
great.
yeah, you'd have to block out a week to just recover from that, I think. But as you said, it's not completely reliable because every sort of filtered through his increasingly destroyed mind. And you know, there are bits where you can't remember where he's put the bottle. But I mean, this is a feature of Lowry's writing that you're not quite sure what you're hearing a lot of the time. Is it external voices? Is it? There are certain times when, you know, Geoffrey thinks he said something and then later you realize he hadn't said it at all, and perhaps he realizes or doesn't quite, you know. And actually, I started reading it this time on an e-reader, but for some reason the formatting was a bit off. So it was very hard to see the line breaks weren't where they should be. It made it almost impossible to read because you just got these voices and sort of fragments coming at you. And it's not the easiest with it as it should be. So, I mean, you've got, I think, a characteristic of it is you've got a sort of cacophony of voices and language coming at you. There's bits in Spanish. That, you know, unless you happen to be a Spanish reader, you're not going to understand. Even if you are, it's difficult. So, I mean, you've already sort of given one warning that people should maybe read the first couple of chapters before deciding how to carry on. In terms of the difficulty, how would you approach that as a reader to get the most out of the novel?
That's another really good question. And it made me rethink about it because I think when I first read it, it does feel a little bit puzzling that obviously they're living in a Spanish-speaking country. The narration is in English, but there's a kind of a self-consciousness about the whole question of different languages and how they're translated within the novel itself. So I suppose the main thing I would say is to go with the flow. It might be that if people listening to this discussion between us, they might like it so much that you read it again. And I think that was Lowry's intention, was that once you reach the end, you would start again at the beginning when that first chapter will mean a lot more to you. And then you'll start to notice some of the Spanish phrases are repeated throughout. They're the same ones. So you kind of get used to them as you go. There is an online companion to Under the Volcano where you can look up everything, should you wish to do that. But I don't actually think that that's necessary. You can often, just looking at the Spanish phrases, you can get a sense of what they must mean. And the most striking one to me is there's a sign about not destroying a public park, which is obviously it's written in Spanish. We're talking about Mexico. And I'm not going to read it in Spanish, but what it says is, do you like this garden, which is yours? Don't let your children destroy it. And it's, I don't know if you can see, but it's on the very last page of the novel. So it kind of pans out as it's addressing the reader at that point, not just the characters in the novel. But the consul looks at that notice a few times during the progress of the plot. And he realizes, I think, that he slightly mistranslated it as thinking, do you like this garden? Why is it yours? So rather than, do you like this garden, which is yours? He's aware of not getting the Spanish quite right. And that mistranslation is quite important. It becomes more menacing, I think, to have those two questions as part of it. So in other words, I think there are two things to say. One is that the everyday ordinary Spanish utterances, notices and sayings and menus achieve a bit more meaning because they're slightly defamiliarized. It's not written in English. You have to struggle to think, what does this mean? And I think the other is that the characters are often thinking about that when they interact with the Spanish speaking characters. People say things in slightly not quite colloquial English that often have a greater meaning than they would had they got it right. Like the character called Dr. Vigil, which is itself a great name, says, throw away your mind. I think by that he means something like put your mind at peace, but suggesting throw away your mind is really more what happens. So that non-idiomatic English actually has a greater significance than if he'd got it completely right. So I suppose ultimately what the novel does something a little bit similar to what much more recent writing, like the example that sprang to my mind is Junot Diaz's short stories called Drown, written by a Dominican American author, much more recently, obviously. And I think Diaz has said that he deliberately didn't translate the Spanish to make the reader kind of get used to it and try to work it out themselves. There's no glossary. So you could say there's almost a kind of decolonial aspect to just presenting the Spanish in the Mexican setting that we find it in, along with other little bits and pieces like little bits of Latin, which aren't translated either.
Yeah.
So to go back to what I said, I would just say go with the flow. You will get used to it, and quite often the Spanish meaning is it's not concealed. You might not get a full sense of what it means, but you can get enough to understand its role for the consul.
As somebody mentioned that they had heard it described as Ulysses for alcoholics. And of course, Ulysses, James Joyce, is, notoriously difficult. I studied it for the first month of my master's was Ulysses, and just went in completely intimidated by this book. And, I think for me, actually, just saying, okay, going with the flow, because you get these editions where every single reference has a note for it, and just going with the flow and sort of, treating it as sort of life hitting you, which is the case in Under the Volcano. Fragments of language are sort of flying at you as they'd fly at Geoffrey's confused mind, I think is part of the point, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot in what you say. To my way of thinking, though Under the Volcano isn't completely different from Ulysses, as you were suggesting, it's a lot easier to read. It's a lot more approachable. I suppose the main thing is you feel you're in, as you were just saying, the consciousness of an individual. And I think it's not to suggest there's an authenticity about a very artistically crafted novel, but I think there is a way in which one's own mind and memory is composed of things that you've read or seen or notices that, or utterances by people that have meant a lot to you that stay in your memory. And in a way, that's what the novel does, little bits and pieces, the fragments, as you said, and particularly the voices. I feel that Lowry really makes a lot of great headway out of overhearing a disembodied voice somewhere, which seems to be addressing you, even though it's a completely separate conversation. He makes a lot out of that. I think the very beginning of the second chapter is a voice saying, a corpse will be transported by express, which is nothing. It's somebody hidden behind a partition who's talking actually about how somebody is moved from one location to another after they've died. But obviously, to the consul who's listening to that, it's a comment on his own mortality, but also the absurdity of how is death thought about? What does death mean? I think we all have those kinds of experience in a new context. And I was thinking about, I suppose about 2/3 of the way through, the consul, his former wife Yvonne, and Hugh, his half-brother, all sit down to have a meal, and the menu has been translated slightly weirdly into English, and that's the thing that people often comment on, I think. And one of the meals on the menu is divorced eggs, But if you look that up, there is actually a dish called in Spanish divorced eggs. It
Mm,
means two eggs together with two different salsa sauces. But obviously, in the context of the novel, it seems slightly defamiliarized. Can that really be something you would eat? And it also is a comment on the idea of being sundered from somebody who you love, being actually divorced, the notion of eggs as suggesting the future, fruitfulness. All of these things are disrupted, played around with,
mm,
made sad, but also funny, as you said
yeah.
right at the beginning.
I think you mentioned earlier there's a sort of spectrality to the novel. Um, and to me, it's almost these fragments kind of haunt Geoffrey, something that's said perhaps innocently in a conversation he has nothing to do with, in his mind, enter and become this echo that becomes increasingly sinister as he sort of twists it to mean something to himself, or sometimes by happenstance, like with the divorced eggs, that obviously applies to his situation and becomes this kind of haunting fragment of language, if you like.
That's right. And sometimes it's completely ordinary, everyday utterances. I was quite struck rereading it that keep off the grass. Obviously, that there's a lot to that sign. He's thinking about Cambridge,
Mm,
where he was a student, and he thinks about the fact that those beautiful lawns are not available for everyone to walk on. But obviously, there's a kind of hinterland of it suggesting the Garden of Eden, keep off the
mm,
grass. You've not been there anymore. It's like a lost paradise. Who can enter into those kind of Edenic spaces and who can't? And I think all of us would feel a recognition of that kind of idea that the voices of authority, just everyday sayings and words, might feel like that,
mm,
whether or not they're actually saying anything. Because another thing that struck me is that because, well, not because the consul knew that Yvonne was coming back, because he didn't know that, but because his half brother has arrived, they've started to redo the swimming pool. And there's a whole passage about what the sound of the water, which is refilling the pool, sounds like. And even that starts to sound as if it's addressing him.
mm,
He hears it go tick tock, the sound of the water, help, help, which is also, it's sad, but it again, it's a very familiar phenomenon. I think that even inanimate objects, animals, swimming pools, can feel as if they're saying something to you.
mm. And I think actually, just to follow up on the point you made, you mentioned Diaz not translating certain words. I think this is increasingly common in contemporary literature as part of, the whole politics to the translation of language. Of course, the idea that English is the lingua franca, what do you translate and what do you not translate, I think is particularly an interesting issue at the moment. And there is a kind of deliberate estrangement, I think, in a lot of novels where, an element of the non-English is preserved. So just wanted to make that point. Um, let's move on to you've mentioned a couple of things that we could interpret as symbolic, the eggs, for example, the idea of the Garden of Eden. Um, and I suppose because reading it, it's so kind of confusing and chaotic. As a reader, my feeling at least is wanting to kind of grasp at something solid as a way of interpreting it, and therefore to read some kind of symbolism into the landscape and the other characters. So, there's the image, for example, it comes up a couple of times of scorpions stinging themselves to death. There's the volcano itself. Do you think there's a kind of a symbolic structure that works sort of coherently throughout the novel, or is it sort of offering you that, but then kind of withdrawing it as well at the same time, if that makes sense?
It absolutely does make sense. And again, I suppose I would preface my answer to your really valuable reflections by saying that the characters too are always aware of the symbolism.
Mm,
Um, that, as we've suggested about the everyday notices, that all of the characters, not just Geoffrey with his heightened awareness because of his drinking, are aware that things that they see and do have an extra resonance. Like, for example, his half brother Hugh looks at his cigarette burning down, he thinks it's burning itself out, like the world is burning itself out. So the characters are aware that there's a double meaning to everything. It's a novel which takes place, as we've said, just on a single day. Obviously, there isn't much space for the characters to do very much. They go out for a walk. They go unfortunately, to a bull throwing event, which isn't like bullfighting, but it's analogous. They're on a local bus. They walk around. They talk to a few people. They're in a few bars, and then evening falls. The consul is on the merry-go-round, the big wheel rather. So there isn't a lot of action, but within that, partly because of their inner worlds, but every small detail of that is made to speak many times. So to go back to your question, I feel the setting itself is a big anchoring device. I was thinking about just the very title of the novel, Under the Volcano. That in itself has got many meanings. I suppose it suggests kind of classical heroes trapped under geographical symbols like that. But it also means under the shadow of the volcano, I suppose, that they are looking up at Ishtarwattle and Popocatépetl, the two, again, a pair of volcanoes who are not together. So again, that's another seen by the characters themselves, again, as another symbol of divorce, of the love of your life not being with you. But also the uncertainty of, are they extinct volcanoes? Will they erupt? Is there danger from them? What does it actually mean? It's like a symbol of perilousness to live under the volcano, which might suddenly pour molten lava on you. To go back to your isolating the symbol of the scorpion who stings itself to death, I do think that, in a way, having said all of that about the setting and the self-consciousness of the characters, I do think that one of the central factors of the novel is that people are their own worst enemies. That's definitely the case with the consul, and he can see that that's the case, that he's undoing himself. He just can't stop himself. He can't decide not to do it. And I think that if we were to say that there's a kind of bigger overall meaning, we might talk separately perhaps about the political angle of the novel. It's that the world is undoing itself. It can see itself falling into a terrible conflict, but it can't prevent it happening. So I think if there's anything towards which the symbolic patterns, of which there are many, tend, it might be towards that. I think right at the beginning, one of the characters in the very first chapter starts talking about Marlowe's notion of Dr. Faustus. And that too is a character who kind of dooms himself. So the tragedy, I suppose, is about that, and a lot of the symbols work towards that feeling as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think absolutely. Let's talk about the political angle in a moment. I think now would be a good time to take a break, and maybe in the second part we can address the sort of rumbling political situation that's in the background and how the novel deals with that. So thank you, Sue, for the first part of the conversation, and please do join us for part two.
Thanks, Ivan.